Web Marketing That Works podcast, episode 122, with today's guest, a repeat guest actually, David Nahill, author of Do You Talk Funny?
Welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. Come behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments and listen in as amazing guests confess the truth about what really works. Now, here are your hosts, Adam Franklin and Toby Jenkins.
My name's Adam Franklin, and you are listening to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Toby Jenkins. How's things, Toby?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Ads.
That is
good to have David back on the show.
Yeah, you interviewed him the first time, and it was actually episode 70. So we've got him on again. His book has been redone, relaunched, re-released, so we're going to talk more about that. And if you are listening to this, you're at the right place if you love marketing on the web. We're going to take you behind the scenes of some real-life marketing experiments. We'll look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll confess what's failed and reveal the truth about what really works. So the show today is brought to you by the book that we wrote called Web Marketing That Works. And there's a gift for you for listening, and that is the bundle of 33 marketing templates from our book. You can get your hands on those at bluewiremedia.com.au/book. So Tobes, we've got David Nahill and his interview that I did with him this time. You interviewed him the first time. And I recall from your chat, you were sort of talking about all the different, or some of the different components that you can add to a speech to make it a lot more funny. And I recall one of the quotes being along the lines of that if you can make people laugh, then they're ready to listen and they're ready to absorb some of the content or the message that you're about to share. So yeah, we've got him back on this time, but we actually talk more about his book release because he launched it back a few years ago and he self-published the first one. He's actually now rewritten about probably 25% of the content, he says, and he has got it published by a publishing house this time, and he's doing a proper book launch for it. So
exciting.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting because he's implemented a few things like flagship content based on the chats we've had with him and based on him reading our book. So he reckons that's had a pretty big impact. But yeah, he's done some interesting things.
For people who didn't hear episode 70, Ads, shall we go into a bit of background on David?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So as you'll notice when he comes on, he's Irish. So he's got a very thick Irish accent. As we said earlier, he wrote the book called Do You Talk Funny? And his whole story is the fact that he's terrified of public speaking. Like he does all these other dangerous activities like kite surfing and cliff jumping, and he swam with sharks and all these things. They don't terrify him. He loves that. But when it comes to standing on a stage and talking to people, he absolutely gets terrified. So part of his little year-long experiment was to learn and practice the skills of a comedian so that he could try and sort of, I guess, unpack what those skills are and apply them to business presentations. Because as he says, like most business presentations you see can be really quite boring at times. And he says if you just implement like one or two techniques that comedians use, you can make the presentation so much more memorable and so much more effective. So that was the purpose of his book, which, as I said, is called Do You Talk Funny? He's been featured in places like Inc., Fast Company, Lifehacker, Forbes, The Huffington Post, and I actually met up with him on that trip I did to San Francisco last year, Tobes, and we met up for a bite to eat and connected in person. He's really funny, really good fella, and that is the story of David Nahill, or the very brief story of David Nahill. How about we kick off the show?
Sounds good.
My name's Adam Franklin, and I am joined by the author of Do You Talk Funny, Mr. David Nahill. How are you, David?
Very good, sir. Yourself?
I'm well. I'm very well, thank you. Now, you're a past guest on the Web Marketing That Works podcast, episode 70, where you spoke to my friend and business partner, Toby Jenkins. This time you've got me, and you do have your book coming out, being re-released, relaunched in a week or so in March 2016. Let's maybe talk a bit about this book journey, because you've self-published the first one and now you're getting it properly published this second time. You happy to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first time when I did your show, I had not read your book, Web Marketing That Works, and I knew nothing about it. And my flagship content was basically me just walking around with a book in my hand. As you know, since then, it's cranked up a few notches thanks to the wisdom in that one. So thanks a million. That was passed on in a parking lot in San Francisco.
That's right. And to be honest, I've read your book, Do You Talk Funny? And it is very entertaining, very funny, laugh out loud funny, in fact. And you know what, if you actually implement some of the stuff, then when you do talk to people from a stage, people actually laugh where they're meant to laugh, which is nice.
Oh, it puts you at so much ease as a speaker when you're like, all right, I know how to recreate this. Like a hit and a laugh, I know how to get it. I know how to recreate it. I know to improve upon it. But I guess that was the concept of the book. It was stuff I did to myself very much as a guinea pig. I had, when we met originally, I had no following, no email list, no social presence, absolutely zero. And I wrote a book and I was like, right, well, I'll give it away for free initially. And I'll try and get some traction that way and then switch it to paid. And thankfully, there was a lot of interest in it. It was basically tips from me pretending to be an accomplished comedian for a full year and faking it and crashing all these comedy clubs in the States and going on tours and festivals and TV show pilots and all sorts of wacky stuff that I never could have imagined. But I guess in all the process, I was so keen just to get the how-to tips in there. I never really put my own story in the first book. And I guess I just ran out of steam with marketing it as well. I didn't really realize if, you read a lot how to make your book a bestseller online, how to get huge traction with it, how to get to number one on Amazon. But keeping it steady in those rankings for someone with no email list and no presence becomes pretty hard unless you're literally full-time marketing the book. So at the end of the day, I was like, right, well, maybe I'll try and find a publisher, go with them, and then I can rewrite it and improve upon it and take on the feedback that I've got from having it on Amazon previously and put it out there again. So yeah, that's been the process. It was a painful lesson to learn, to tell your own story in your book and just don't be content heavy and don't be like how to heavy, like actually wrap that information in a bit of a story that people resonate with. So yeah, it's probably taken me a year to correct that mistake. Lesson learned the hard way.
Better late than never.
Oh, it was shocking. But I mean, it was nice. At least the way I did it originally was a bit of reverse engineering on the concept of the book, because I was like, right, well, I have no audience. So how do I test the idea for this book without telling my friends I'm pretending to be a comedian for a year with no intention of being a comedian or worrying my family that I've just left my job and I'm up to some very strange stuff? So the best conclusion I came to was to test it as an online e-course and host it on a platform. Basically, I just put together a presentation. There was my thoughts on the topic and started trying to sell it to people. And I wasn't selling it myself. I put it on a platform where they were very heavily promoting all courses at the time, which was Udemy. And it gave me nearly 1,000 people in there within a month that I was able to test the concepts with. So it made it good to really test out my concepts, get money for it in the process, validate it at a higher price point, and then be able to incorporate their feedback. So it was kind of like working on a live book. And then I just had it transcribed when it got to a period that I liked it, and then started to work with an editor and work on it to clean it up.
That's really interesting. So what you put all that, I guess, what is it, more the extended content of you talking and your presentations and everything into Udemy, and then see what get the most hits and the most comments and the most traction, and then sort of put more of that stuff in the book, right?
Exactly. So it's just to see what are people resonating with. Like with the e-courses these days, you can watch the completion rates and you can see where the drop-offs are with each lecture. So you can see if it's not concise enough. They'll write to you with questions going, oh, I didn't like this, I like that. And, online courses have a very low engagement rate, to be honest, and a very low completion rate, and much lower, I would suspect, than any of these platforms advertise. But you'll still get a couple of people there once they've paid for it at a higher price point than a book traditionally, that are really, really into the content, and they will exchange emails with you. They will tell you what they like and what they don't like. And it gives you a way to really hone the material. And I guess for me, I was dyslexic and I have no background in writing whatsoever. Like, I'm a disaster of an author in any way. I never even imagined myself doing it. So my theory was, if I dictated it, well, I tried doing it via dictation services, but an Irish accent, I suspect, like a heavy Aussie accent sometimes, doesn't do you much favors with online dictation services. So I just recorded my voice and I hired someone via Odesk to transcribe the course once I got it to where I liked it. And at least that way, psychologically, it was me looking at like 180, 190 pages of content or even more, and then just editing that down rather than looking at a blank page and be like, man, how am I going to write a book about this? So I just found the presentation and the course was a good way to kind of walk myself into it, but equally get some feedback on some content and make it in my voice, because you often hear writers talking about trying to find your voice. And I was like, well, if I just record my voice, surely that'll save me a bit of trouble, because it'll sound like me. So, and the funny thing is, the feedback I get on it a lot of the time is, this book's written like a guy having a conversation with you in a pub. And I was like, well, I could have been doing that when I was recording the course. I can't swear against it. But it's funny, it does seem to me like, oh, that's a good shortcut. And then as the course grew, like at the moment on Udemy, and without me ever promoting it in any way, I think it's their highest enrolled for public speaking, and I think it's their highest rated as well from people going through it, because I was constantly iterating with it and making changes and just seeing what people are liking and what they're not liking. So ultimately then when I released a book, I was like, well, thanks to you guys and all your feedback, we now have a book. And then ultimately you have somebody to market that book to. And that was enough to give it traction. But it was also enough to go to publishers and be like, well, I was selling this for 99 bucks online, and $99 US people were paying for it in some cases, not all of them, because, some of them buy it at a discount price. But the fact that a lot of people in high numbers are willing to pay the course at a much higher price point than a book, then give publishers a level of confidence in your idea. So you're not going to them and being like, hey, I'm kind of good at marketing, I'll be able to drive this. Because as you know, these days with publishers, they just care if you can market the book, because they're not going to invest a whole lot of resources in doing that for you, or none at all.
Yeah. Yeah. If you can demonstrate you've got a platform and you can move some copies, then that's certainly, I reckon, what they're looking at primarily.
Yeah, 100%. Because, their specialties is printing books. And I did not know that from the beginning. I don't think any author does. You learn it the hard way. And you're like, what else do you do apart from print the books? And they're like, that's it. We print the books.
So did you get an editor for your book? Like if you got it all transcribed and you had all these pages of you in your voice sort of thing, did you then have an editor, or did you have to do that yourself?
No, I did. I literally just looked at right, who are my favorite writers? Who are they using as an editor? Who are they using as a cover designer? And I was like, well, if I make enough money out of the course, I'm just going to hire and approach those guys. So I did. I hired the editors and designers used by authors that I like a lot. And I got to work with one particular editor who knew more about comedy than I did, which was great. He was really into the topic, and that really helps drive it down, someone who's kind of been there and done that. So that was great, actually, and it allowed me to keep the bones of the book when I went then to a publisher and be like, well, no, this is already really popular content. We just want to clean it up a bit. I don't want to totally rewrite everything that's been working. So yeah, I've had a couple of editors on it, but the one that shaped it the most, the one I paid for myself, was the very first one that I went to with all that dictated content and was like, all right, this is loosely. Now I did do some writing myself and try and put some story around on my own personal story to some level, or some bits of humor in there. So, you don't want to call a book, Do You Talk Funny? And then there's nothing funny at all. They're just like, that's a lot of pressure. And then they're like, come and speak about your book. And they're like, that guy wasn't funny speaking or in his book. That's the worst book ever. So there is a pressure there to put some lighthearted stuff in there. But at the end of the day, it's a business book about public speaking. So you don't want to get too carried away. So it's a bit of a fine line.
It's certainly very, very amusing. Yeah, I
thank you.
An editor, like when Tobes and I wrote our book that you mentioned earlier, we sort of handed in our manuscript, and it was okay. But when it came back from the editor, we thought, man, this guy's worth his weight in gold. He sort of took all our ramblings and put it into something that actually made sense and sounded reasonably good. So I don't think we could have done it without our editor.
Yeah, and I think you need that person to go, all right, that's great. No, thank you. And you're like, but I really like that story. And they're like, yeah, rubbish, doesn't add to the book, gone. And it's very hard to consciously edit your own work like that, because obviously you're too invested in it, in writing it, in the time to really consciously edit it down. But yeah, super helpful. But it was nice having that stuff tested already. I won't lie to you. And it was nice. My one's in a bit of a niche. So anyone who has an interest in public speaking or has to do a lot of public speaking, you really don't want to read a long book about public speaking. You don't want to read multiple books about public speaking. Very few of them, if any, are anyway exciting to read whatsoever. And I know because I read them all. So I was like, all right, I want a short, concise book that people can get a bit of a laugh out of, get a little bit of a story out of, and get a whole heap of takeaways out of, that they're just like, all right, actionable, I can do this. So it was cool. And I think when you present that information first in a course, that those people who take a course, they want the actionable elements in it. So they end up working your way into the book to some extent. And they work because you've already tested them with people and you've got good feedback. So that's been helpful as well in making it kind of a how-to book. So yeah, if you told me I'd write a book once, I would have told you were totally mad that I have more chance of getting myself pregnant than ever writing a book. And then if you were like, you're going to write a self-help book, I'd be like, oh no, even worse, not a self-help book. And I'd be like, you're going to write one on public speaking. I'm like, oh, I hate public speaking. Why would I do that? But yeah, it's funny how these things just snowball, and now I'm left with it. Worst plan ever.
Because you've always said you're scared of public speaking. You do tons of risky, dangerous, sort of terrifying stuff like bungee jumping and cliff jumping and kite surfing and all these crazy things. But you've said that getting up on a stage has been something that's terrified you more than all these swimming with sharks, you name it.
Everything. I hate it. I've always hated it. And, I still don't like it. But the difference is now is if you're in the audience, you won't know that I'm hating life. Like, you won't know that I'm sweating bullets out of my hands and I'm about to lay an egg and I'm nervousness. But, it's just reframing that and realizing, like, all right, I always feel like this. This is totally normal. My heart's always going to beat faster. My hands are always going to sweat a bit. Like, the only time that doesn't happen is when you don't care about the consequences of what you're doing. So it's good to have that there. And I don't think anyone ever comes up to you really and does a good job of telling you that, like, hey, oh, you're here speaking at the conference. Me too. Are you really nervous? I'm really nervous. Like, they don't do that enough. Like, these guys look really polished and slick. And to be honest, I felt like maybe they are all going through the same thing as me. And a lot of them are. And the nice thing is it is manageable over time. Like, you can totally fake it when you're up there and it can become enjoyable for you. If you're standing in front of a crowd and they're all laughing and they're all engaged with what you're saying, it quickly goes from being something that's horrendous that's kind of enjoyable when you're up there. But yeah, I still don't look forward to doing it.
All right then, David. So you said earlier that you did this year-long experiment or project where you crashed comedy clubs and you pretended to be a comedian. And what prompted you to do that?
Yeah, worst plan ever. I mean, anyone I explained that to, they're like, really? Did you think that was a good plan at the time? And you're like, no, no whatsoever. It was a friend of mine actually who tragically suffered a spinal cord injury and his insurance provider cut him off. So we were trying to do fundraisers to raise money for his recovery. I thought I had the good idea of organizing a comedy show because I knew a comedian at the time. I didn't know my friends would insist on me hosting it. So it was kind of just not to embarrass myself. I wanted to do it because, like, up to that point, I would have described my fear of public speaking as crippling. But when your friend is faced with a much more heavier implication of the word, all of a sudden you're like, well, I better get over this. Like, what I'm facing is nothing compared to what this guy's about to go through in his recovery. So I studied comedians to try and get over it. I figured they were going to be the true masters of public speaking. And the charity show went so well, I ended up being asked by the guy to open for him in some big famous comedy club, even though I hadn't really done it before. So I was like, right, you know what? I might just keep this going for a year. I was a big fan of authors like AJ Jacobs and Tim Ferriss who go deep into a topic and look at applying the 80-20 principle and breaking it down and seeing like what 20% of the actions give the greatest amount of results. And can you do it quickly? So I was like, I'm just going to do this for a year. So it's quite hard to get bookings as a comedian no one's ever heard of. So I made a website and I made like a fake Facebook fan page and Twitter followers, Facebook fan page, I should say, and made it look like this character had been around for a while under the stage name Irish Dave, which didn't seem very original to me. It seemed like it.
And so you did that for a year. You learned how comedians make things funny and you practiced it and implemented it and were able to obviously be a comedian for that period of time. And you know what? Now you've decided to apply and teach all of those principles so that people that do business presentations at conferences like me, and a lot of these conferences can tend to be a little bit boring, we can actually apply those same comedy techniques.
Not you, of course, but those are the conferences in general put, I think, most people to sleep that attend them regularly. So the idea was, I don't teach it, to be honest. That's not my core business, but I did. That's what I wrote the book about. And I just wanted to be able to leave a manual there, whereas anyone can pick it up and go, all right, cool. Like some of these are really quickly achievable. And it's very much aimed at breaking down TED Talks, essentially, as opposed to, so it's taking techniques that comedians use, but the average person does not want to be a comedian because it sounds like the scariest plan ever and not a good idea. And it takes a certain type of idiot like me to go ahead with that plan and try it out, especially when you hate public speaking. Like, a lot of respect for comedians. That is a tough job. But the average business speaker does not want to be a comedian, but they do want to get a few laughs. They do want to up the engagement. If they go on after a speaker that was really good and got lots of laugh, like suddenly you're really conscious of it and you kind of want to be that guy. So I just wanted to provide and highlight the techniques that top TED speakers are using at the moment that just happen to be the exact same techniques that comedians have been using forever to up engagement and make people aware of that.
So maybe let's talk about a couple of these techniques, because I know there's actually some easy things you can do that can work really well, and then there's some more of a journey of sort of uncovering some of the funny stuff you might already have and you didn't realize. So let's start with some of the easy things that you can do to actually make your presentation a bit more funny.
Yeah, I mean, and number one, if a lot of people, you'll say, all right, put in a funny story, and they'll be like, I don't have a funny story that comes to them straight away. So and everybody will say that, like, no, I haven't got one. But the funny thing is what a comedian will do, and what someone who's very experienced at this will do, is literally on their smartphone, open a list and call it funny story file. And every time they hear a conversation that's funny, or they see something that's funny, or anything that makes them laugh, whether it's a funny email or a customer complaint or a really weird thing that your boss says, they literally just write that down, and they continuously go back to this list and just mine it for little nuggets just to like really shoehorn into your presentation. And there's always a way of squeezing that in there and linking it to a life lesson or a problem that you've solved, because obviously you wouldn't be in business if you weren't solving a problem for somebody. So it's often just telling the stories of funny, quirky stories of customer success stories, or things that happen to you on the way to getting where you're going. And if that sounds too crazy in itself, literally just take funny images and memes and GIFs and videos and stick them into your presentation and treat them like the punchline. So literally, I think a mistake a lot of business speakers make is they have a funny image that they want to show, and they show that funny image and then they comment on it. So they treat the funny image as a setup, and then their words of hilarity after revealing the image as the punchline. But it's actually the opposite way around. The image is the punchline, and your job as the person who's about to get the laugh from the image is to set it up to get the maximum surprise. So if you're like, everything we were feeling at this moment, everything on the line, everything could be shown by this one image, and then it's your smiling panda, which I think I've seen you use, or the laughing panda. And then that's when that really kicks a laugh, because it's the element of surprise on the image that they see. And then you can say additional funny things after it, and they'll still get a little bit of a laugh. But it's very hard to get a bigger laugh than when you build up the image, reveal the image, which is the surprise, and let the image be the funny part itself. And literally, you just go on Imgur or Google Images and type funny with whatever topic you're looking for, and use something and shoehorn that into your presentation. So rather than telling people how you felt at a certain moment, show them a funny image that represents it. And that's just not used by people out there trying to be funny. Like if you watch Amy Cuddy's TED Talk, which is the second most viewed of all time at the moment, and I can't remember the number of views, but it's huge, second most popular, and she's using funny images throughout. She even plays a video that's made by, a team of professional comedians for the UK that already had gone viral. And what happens when she plays those during the talk? They, of course, get a laugh if she facilitates it. And even if she screws up facilitating it, she still gets a laugh because the content is that good.
Yeah, funny video that's funny on its own 2 feet is so easy just to put into a presentation. Hey, and you taught me that, and it's just, it's going to work. You don't have to do anything really you can set it up as you say, but it's still going to be funny, even if you just hit play and stand there.
Yeah, and it's still funny. And then the additional laugh, like the funny that people react to it is the first surprise. And then the easiest bit of funny is you just call attention to things in the image. So like if the eyes are a little bit weird, or they're blocked, or there's a color that's more prominent than anything else, or there's something a little bit quirky about the image itself, then you comment on that and you'll probably get another laugh, which just builds on the first one. But the sequence is quite important to treat that image as the punchline itself. Okay. And not your words after the image goes up as the punchline.
Right. And so the stuff that comes up, like the extra laughs you get after that punchline, they're called taglines, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that's when you're just writing your glory. You're like, ooh, they laughed. I think I'll stick some more on here. Yeah. So it tends to be smaller laughs, but it just keeps a chuckle going, and it's an easy way of doing it. Right.
And so what are the main mistakes you see boring business presenters make?
Yeah, there's a few. I would say we've talked about this before, I think in the past, was never finish on a Q&A. Like that one, it's going to end badly most of the time. Like don't allow it to happen. So if you give your business talk, do your Q&A, build it into your talk. So as you approach the end of the talk, just literally say, all right, I'm going to take a few questions now before I make my conclusion. And that way, if nobody asks you any questions, or they ask you crazy questions, it gives you an excuse to just move on, shut it down, and close it off in a way that you have planned to do it in the strongest fashion. So you ideally save one slide till the end that has 3 key points from your talk. And that way you go out to a strong round of applause. Everybody knows it's over. They know to give you a bit of love for being up there as a presenter, but you're also more memorable because you're leaving them with your key points. And I think a lot of people don't do that. A very simple one is with your introduction and your bio. So give it to somebody in its shortest, most effective form to read for you so that you can just start your talk in the action. You can start with something funny or a story about you, but you're not having to talk about your achievements because nobody wants to hear you stand up there and have to talk about what you've what you've done that allows you to be there. They assume you're an expert because you're on stage. So a lot of people, I think, don't realize that their performance or their talk or their business talk that day begins with the bio reading in the introduction. And a way to manipulate that and come out with more energy is just to make sure that your name is only revealed as the very last two words of that bio. So you'll hear a lot of business speakers say, oh, well, next up we have Adam. Adam is a good friend of mine. Adam's had a lot of success with his book, and Adam and Toby work together. Please give it up for Adam. I've said your name so many times in that introduction. The name is the cue for people to applaud and welcome you. But the more I use that, the less anticipation there is as who might this guy be. So our next speaker is the founder of Bluewire Mirror. He's the author of Web Marketing That Works. He and his business partner have this successful business. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Mr. Adam Franklin. And then they know to applaud and give you a full warm reception at the saying of your name. Plus, they're also excited to figure out who you might be because you can't take it for granted that they all read the speaker roster and they all know who's up next.
It's amazing how hard it is to get MCs or people who introduce you to actually read out your introduction and not put the name first. Like, even if you give it to them, so often they say,
I would
the next
write
speaker
it
is Adam Franklin. And you go, that's not what's written down. Why are you saying this?
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to literally hand them, like email it to them in advance, but also write it on the card, type it to them and hand it to them. So if they look terrible reading out your bio, that's totally fine. You're just worried that you want to get off to a good start. So, I mean, it does help a lot because otherwise you'll find that a part of you tries to justify why they should be listening to you in your talk. And you kind of divert, and all of a sudden you're nearly like reading a list of achievements at some stage. And it's very hard for the audience to like you when you're doing that, when you're talking about your successes, because they naturally want to hear you talking about your failures. And if they don't like you and you're selling yourself to them and they feel like that, then they're not going to laugh at your jokes. And no matter how funny those little stories that you build into the presentation are. So it's funny how that can all go sideways just from the introduction. So very, very, very important to nail that. Business speakers are pretty bad as well for not acknowledging things that are happening in the room. So a fire alarm goes off and they'll be like, we'll just keep going with these slides because I've got another 50 to get through. And you're like, whereas a comedian, if someone falls over a chair or sneezes or anything, anybody trained in comedy will know that the easiest laughs you're ever going to get in life come from just acknowledging the obvious. So if someone says something crazy, does something crazy, it's too warm in there, the lunch was terrible, any shared experience between you and the audience is a really easy joke. And that also lends itself to calling back to watch the three speakers before you, like proper memorize your talk. And there's a technique you can do that called the Memory Palace. There's a book on it by Joshua Foer called Moonwalking with Einstein. It's very good to try it out. But if you're very confident that you're not going to go blank on stage, you can chill out a bit. You watch the three speakers before you. And that way, if they say anything cool or funny, you just reference it again in your talk. And that's an immediate laugh called a callback in comedy. Everybody will laugh. It's impromptu. It's a shared experience. And they give you good credit for that. But two, if that business speaker has talked about something that you're about to talk about, it's really weird for the audience to be like, why is this guy saying the same stuff as the speaker like an hour ago? Does he not know that the guy already gave that talk? And the truth is, a lot of the time, the business speaker doesn't know because he was backstage going over his big bullet point list.
Can you do callbacks from speakers like a day or two previously, or is it typically just literally the three before you on the day?
Yeah, I wouldn't go past the three before you. It's weird. Even if you're, say, at the end of the day around 4 p.m. and you reference somebody went on at 9 a.m., they don't react as quick as they should. So you're really using the recency principle on it, or the fact that it's very fresh in their mind. And if you go further back than three speakers, unless somebody did something really spectacularly and memorable and something crazy happened, then I would just go with the three before you.
What if you're first on in the morning and the last three were yesterday?
Yeah, I wouldn't reference it because a lot of people won't be in the room and they were there the day before, and you can't really assume that. Like, conferences to put people to sleep have a pretty good drop-off rate. This is fair, especially after the first party night. So you can find your audience is quite different. So I wouldn't reference that, because then again in the video, these days, like everything you do is going to be either periscoped or stuck online somewhere, and you're referencing things that online audience all of a sudden isn't in on that joke either.
Yeah. So speaking of online stuff, Periscope or webinars, or even like this podcast is good because it's a conversation between the two of us. So your jokes I might find funny and I laugh and you get that real feedback. How do you find it like doing, like say, even if it's a solo show as a podcast or a webinar where you're like presenting your slides or you're talking to your camera, but you don't get that real-time feedback? Can you still be funny, or what's doing there?
Yeah, but it is so much harder. If you have real faith, or you get in what you're saying is funny, that you've tried it with a real audience before and you know it works, cool. I mean, you can give people their cues. So if you really like something that much to put it into this webinar, talk, or podcast, or it's just you creating content by yourself, it's totally fine for you just to laugh at it as you're delivering it, if you really enjoy it that much. And then, they tend to at least see the lighthearted nature. And if you're in pieces laughing by yourself creating content, and you admit to it, you're like, sorry guys, I really like this one. They're going to think it's funny that you're even weird enough to laugh and like your own stuff. So there's no real downside to that. And I'm pretty sure in the online course I have, there's a bit in there somewhere where I'm just laughing away at my own jokes to an audience of nobody. Because I honestly, when I created the course originally, it was literally me at home in my underpants, like doing a voiceover on some slides. And then the online Udemy contacted me and they're like, listen, your content's very popular, but the delivery is horrendous. Like, you're not even on the video. You have to be in there. And at that stage, I was in Brazil and I got used to the passive income it was creating. And I was like, oh no, gonna have to record this properly. And it just so happened someone gave me free access to a studio to do it. And they had like a proper TV camera setup. But I was so nervous about doing it that I insisted that they just leave me in the room, turn the cameras on, and give me like 9 hours of footage, and I'll just edit it myself. Like, don't worry about it. Leave me alone. Don't watch the screens. Just pretend I'm not in here. And it was just me talking away to myself for a long time, and it was really challenging. So like with your question, it's tough. It's tougher because there's nothing like the real feedback that an audience gives you and the energy that creates. But if you really believe something is funny and it doesn't bore you to tell it and you actually enjoy telling it, well, then, let that show. Like, your smile or your own laughter is the cue for somebody else to engage with that content in a way like they were actually there interacting with you.
And how about then, like, if you tell a joke or you think it's funny in a live setting and it falls flat, like, what happens then? I'm sure there's lots of listeners who are terrified of that moment.
Yeah, well, a very good way of avoiding that is, a lot of people do badly at comedy because they set up a joke that's very visibly a joke. But if you just happen to tell a story and the story just happens to be funny, it's funny, but you delay the funny component to the very last possible part of your story and you tell it in a short form, then if people don't laugh, all you were doing, is telling them a story. And people naturally like listening to stories. If they laugh, great. If they don't, you just told the story. You were still 90% more engaging than the other business speakers that day who were boring the pants off people with facts and figures. So the way to avoid that real risk moment where it doesn't work is to tell your joke as a story and not as something that's visibly a joke. Because if you come out and you're like, a mushroom walks into a bar, I'm like, oh, this is going to suck. Like, straight. And I've had that where I've done a podcast or two interview and the guy will be like, let me tell you a joke. And I'm like, I know this is going to be terrible. Should I fake laugh or should I just break it to him? Like, what do I do here? And the thing is, when somebody visibly is about to tell you a joke, your mind either just went, this should be funny because this guy's normally funny, or this is going to be horrendous. And you don't want to give people that moment. So I would say stay away from jokes that are very much visibly a joke. Stick to true things from your own life that you just happen to think are funny. And if it bombs and if it does fail, just literally admit it and be like, wow, that was way funnier when I practiced at home with my cat last night. I need to stop giving business talks to my cat. It's obviously not representative of this shared experience. And you can go as far with that as you want, but as long as you acknowledge that you know what you said wasn't funny and you visibly failed, the audience will still love you for it. Like, that's fine. It's only when you try and be funny and you think you just did something awesome and witty and they didn't really react to it, then they start to think you suck quickly. So like, comedians are very good for just acknowledging that, going, oh wow, like I saw a guy, it was my favorite line, I think. He just looked at them and he's like, wow, as an audience you guys laugh really sparingly. Yeah. and they all laughed. And then he just went back to it. Like, it was forgiven. In that little smart comment, he had acknowledged that he was trying to be funny. They didn't think it was funny, and let's move on to something else. So it's call attention to it. Like, if you're doing terribly, I was hosting an event. It's a storytelling series and competition in the US that I'd won in the past. So they asked me to come and host it last week. And I did such a bad job of hosting it. Like, it's a competition. So the guy tells a story, and then you're meant to get marks from the audience, and then everybody celebrates if he wins or not. I totally forgot to get marks from the audience. So I was just like, and we move on to our next contender. And they're like, wait, you didn't get the scores for the last guy. And I was like, wow, well, this is what you get for importing mildly illegal immigrants from other countries to host your events. Yeah. And, they all laugh, and it's a shared experience. And yeah, the joke is at my expense, but, it's fine. At least I acknowledge that I'm screwing things up, and we move on. It was funny.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, it works. They will forgive you because ultimately the audience, they're there because they want to see a cool experience. And if you're doing terribly, they feel bad for you, and they literally want the ground to open up and you to be able to disappear and go home and pour yourself a beer because you need it. Like, they don't want to see you do bad. But at the same time, they don't want to hear about you talking about your success. They want to hear you talking about your failures and how you struggled to achieve that success. So if life was very hard as you were getting your first few customers or on the way to selling your book, how horrible a process was it? Tell them that before you drop any success on them in any way.
Yeah, interesting. And how do you find, like, the American audiences? Because I'm Australian, you're Irish. I think our cultures are a lot more conservative and humble. Like, the Americans sometimes can talk themselves up a lot, and it seems to be a lot more natural for them. Like, are the audiences different in your experience? Because you live in America. Do you find that?
I do. Yeah, it takes a bit of getting used to. Like, if you're trying to sell yourself or your products in any way, they expect you to say that you're pretty cool at it, or at least give them an inclination of the success you've had in that area. But to be honest, as a crowd, when it comes to humor and stuff, if you're just telling a story, the nice thing about funny stories is everybody loves funny stories. The audience is 100% universal for that. There's nobody that's ever going to like, oh, stop telling me those stories. And like, it doesn't happen. But I mean, the sense of humor here is definitely different. The very Jerry Seinfeld, very refined, very sparse on the words in its most effective short form, like ready for television. I think most Australian comics and most Irish comics are not like that. And the humor we have is a little bit different. It's more witticisms and in the moment, and it's more banter, and it's more naturally storytelling. So I think, to be honest, what we have culturally lends itself to being really good on stage because you react to things fast in the moment. Like, you're used to your mates sitting down the pub making fun of you at high speed over a bunch of pints on the weekend. You're used to that banter and the quick comeback, and you're used to telling stories. And if you can do those two things on stage and be yourself, people like you a lot for it, regardless of if it's a US audience or an Australian audience.
Nice. Hey, I reckon we're getting pretty close to a wrap for this show. Are there any final pieces of wisdom or anything you want to get off your chest before we call it a day?
Yeah, anything you want to have a rant about. Well, now that you brought it up. No, we're all good. I mean, to be honest, I just think there's so many boring business presentations out there, and anybody who's giving a boring business presentation, they don't want to give a boring business presentation. Just nobody told them, here's a couple of things that will really make a difference for you, or you hate it, I've got something that can help. So, I mean, the book I have is coming out, and if you want to check that out, great. But if you don't, I have like 80 tips, which is the flagship content that you told me, or you rubbed off on me and I created it. So the book has a whole load of tips in it, but you can get those for free by going to number7comedyhabits.com, and it's 80 tips and you can download it there. But honestly, they'll make a big difference. You just read them and you're like, all right, I didn't know that. Okay, I'll do that. So like, get out there, have a bit of fun with the public speaking and the presentations for anyone who's listening. Like, your audience will thank you for it because the standards are so low. You are competing against people who are boring people to pieces on average. And if you just stick in a few funny images, literally a couple of funny GIFs, a couple of funny images, and at least one story about who you are, what you're doing there, or something relatable from your life, you will stand out as a good speaker really fast, and it becomes a lot more enjoyable for everybody.
That's awesome. So I highly recommend the book, Do You Talk Funny? Grab it over at Amazon, leave a review, and download that 80 tips from 7comedyhabits.com.
That's the one.
Where can people get in contact with you, David?
You can email me at david@funnybizwith2z's.co, or I'm on Twitter at funnybizsf, which is intentionally the worst Twitter handle I could find because I don't plan on using it a whole lot. But if you write to me there, I will get in touch with you. I don't dispense much wisdom on there, but I am contactable that way. We have a blog over at Funny Biz on the using business and using humor in elements of marketing and content creation, and then on the public speaking is at 7 Comedy Habits.
Good man. David, thanks for being a return guest on the show, and you have yourself a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me. You too.
Cheers, mate. See ya. So that's a wrap from my chat with David Nahill.
Yeah, cool. That's good to have him back on the show, as we said earlier. So what was your take home from this particular episode?
Look, I thought it was interesting how he is going about his new book launch. Like the first time he did it, he had no audience, no list, no nothing, but he wrote it and put it out there. But interestingly, as he said, didn't put his own stories in there or enough of his own stories. And this time round, he's tightened it up. He's incorporated a lot of his story, which I think makes the reading experience a lot more enjoyable. It was enjoyable the first time, but even more enjoyable because we get more of a feel as to who this David Nahill fella is. And talking us through how he actually refined his content. Like, I loved how he was putting his content on Udemy, and he could then see which content had the most traction, got the most comments, got the most downloads, and then he really knew what was the most popular and useful stuff. So he could use that data or that information that he got and then put all the best bits into the book. So he kind of reverse engineered it, which I thought was really neat.
Clever use of those sorts of platforms, that's for sure.
Yeah. And we sort of touched on some of the things, mistakes people make, like having question time at the very end. So just instead of doing question time and then making your closing comments, like you always want to finish with the last word and some really powerful closing statements. And even, just like the power of stories and kicking off a presentation with a story, and ideally a story that shows your vulnerability or shows that you can muck things up as well. He said people don't want to hear about how wonderful and successful you are. That's the intro's job or the MC's job, to sort of talk you up. But people want you to be vulnerable and transparent and a bit, talk about your failures, not so much feeling like, talking like you're on a pedestal. So I find that pretty interesting.
Yeah, good advice.
Now, Tobes, that is a good place to finish up there. The show, as always, brought to you by our book, Web Marketing That Works, and specifically the bonus 33 marketing templates. If you want to drop us a line, you know where we are. You can reach me at adam.franklin@bluewiremedia.com.au. And Tobes, how about you?
Yeah, I'm toby.jenkins@bluewiremedia.com.au.
Cool. Guys, if you enjoyed the show, and I hope you did, I'd love it if you could leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, and I look forward to seeing you on the next show.